Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, my name is Heide Hackman, and as CEO of the International Science Council, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar on rethinking economics in the light of COVID and future crises. I want to extend a special welcome and express our sincere thanks to a very illustrious group of colleagues who are with us today. Our keynote presenters, Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, our discussants, Jayati Ghosh, Luke Suter, and Danielle Allen, and our chair, Craig Calhoun, who has not only agreed to moderate our discussion today, but has also provided invaluable advice and support in the preparation of this event. Let me also acknowledge and thank my colleague, David Kaplan, for his leadership in bringing all of us together, as well as those from the ISC communications team for their support and outreach work around this webinar. Colleagues, for those of you who don't know, just a word about the ISC. We are a global membership-based organization that convenes academies and research councils from around 140 or more countries, as well as international scientific unions and associations that represent the natural and the social sciences. Our vision is of science as a global public good, and our mission to be the global voice for science. As you can imagine, much of our work this year has focused on convening discussion and action in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, covering a very broad range of complex and challenging questions. Today's webinar picks up on two sets of questions that are of primary importance to us. On the one hand, questions about the impacts of the pandemic and of future global crises, indeed, on science itself and on different fields of science in particular. And on the other hand, questions about the role of science in supporting societies and economies to be less prone to crisis, more resilient to shocks when they arise, by pursuing more sustainable and transformative development pathways. These are questions that are before us today and that we will address through the lenses of the economic sciences. I look forward to our discussion and want to encourage you, our audience, to interact with us throughout today's discussion, but beyond as well, to use the chat function in Zoom to share any ideas you may have as to how we might continue this conversation, extending it to other disciplines in the social sciences. And of course, please feel free to pose questions in the question box. With thanks again to all of you for joining us, I hand over to our chair. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Heide. And may I express my thanks, and I think those of all of us on the panel, to the International Science Council, to you, to David Kaplan, who did the central organizing work to prepare for this seminar. It is a welcome feature of the International Science Council that it sees social and behavioral sciences as a central part of the science enterprise. The ISC is a leading voice for science in this. And so we will hope that in our panel today, we live up to this illustrious sponsorship. So welcome. Welcome not to this webinar only, but to an era of new complexities and recurrent shocks. Our theme is at once the upheavals and transformations in economic affairs and the question of how ready economics is to help us understand those transformations and upheavals and act effectively in regard to them. The world had not recovered from the financial crisis and the policies chosen in response to the financial crisis when it confronted the COVID pandemic. The pandemic raises anew the questions of how our economic organization shapes our response, our resilience, and sadly, our suffering in relation to the pandemic. Economics itself is changing as a field of research, as a field of education, and as a field of public policy. We are fortunate to have with us two leading participants to help us understand what is going on in the world and in economics, and then three remarkably strong discussants to engage with them and elaborate the themes. Samuel Bowles He's the Arthur Spiegelman Research Professor at the Santa Fe Institute and also teaches at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as he has through most of his career. His work has been both innovative and influential for decades. Schooling in Capitalist America with Herbert Gintis transformed how we understand the relation of education to the economy. He has since studied selfishness versus altruism and inequality versus economic access. And among his major publications recently is The Moral Economy: Why Good Incentives Are No Substitute for Good Citizens. Wendy Carlin is Professor of Economics at University College London and Research Fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research, and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. She has done extensive research on macroeconomics, institutions, and economic performance, the economics of transition, the evolution of economic research, and education using machine learning, but she is known to many also as a pioneer in rethinking education and economics and the way that it prepares both economists and informed citizens. With no more ado, I want to turn the screen over to Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin, who will perform for us together. They told me not to say they would sing a duet. Over to you.
Thanks for the introduction. Wendy and I are very happy to be with all of you today. On the screen, you see a retrospective on another crisis, the bubonic plague. This is 100 years after Europe was devastated, and you see they recall a century later with terror the experience that they had had. But if you look very carefully, you'll also notice that they are washing their hands up in the upper right. So they obviously did learn something that we have to take over. Now, let me start by saying that when I think what we will have learned from this crisis, Wendy and I say we're very, very proud to be scientists. We think the scientific community has done a fantastic job. So many people we know who had pressing things to do in their own research and family life and so on, just dropped everything and said, well, is there something I know that can be helpful here? Whether they were network theorists or epidemiologists, economists, and so on. It's a really, really impressive display. And in economics also, I think we've been aided here by fundamental changes that have gone on in the economics, in the discipline of economics, at least among those doing research, if not in the way we educate our students, and we'll come back to that towards the end. Wendy and I are quite convinced that the pandemic itself has accelerated the process of change within economics. You see a slightly speeded up version in the cartoon there. On the left, you have the student studying for her exam in 2019, and she's studying such words as optimal, efficient, profit, price, supply, demand, and so on. 2 years later, that is the coming year in the spring, she will be having exams even if she's not having classes, so she's cramming, but look what she's learning there. External effects, social interactions, tipping point, disequilibrium processes, and so on. It won't happen that fast, but Wendy and I are trying to accelerate it, and we think that though it's sad that this had to happen, the pandemic itself is pushing economics in a very good direction. Reality also is pushing in a good direction. Just yesterday, Bloomberg published, you've probably seen it, a list of the worst places to be during the pandemic and the best places. On the right, you see the best places. And of course, there'll be a great deal of debate about what does it mean? What can we learn from that list? But one thing for sure we learned, this is not a prescription for individualism or for the idea that harnessing self-interest is the only big idea for public policy, or the idea of limited government. It would be hard to read that list to support those that ideology which has so dominated economics in the past. At least what you hear people talking on TV, it's not what people are doing in their research. what people are doing research-wise is really quite exciting. We've really moved to a bunch of new ideas in economics, which I think are going to help a lot. Think about an epidemic. What is that? It's the epitome of what's called an external effect in economics. External effects are things like environmental spillovers and so on, sometimes called externalities. Well, that's what a pandemic is. Now, until recently ignored, barely taught, maybe the last chapter of the book, now it's quite central. So economics has abandoned the idea that we can represent the economy just as a set of markets. We're bringing in what are now called non-market social interactions. Well, you want to know what a non-market social interaction is? It's when I cough on you, and that's contagion. That's what an externality is today. Everybody knows externalities is what's going on in the world today. And further, when you think about it, what's mask wearing? Mask wearing is a public good. It's a benefit to others, actually more beneficial to others than to oneself. Or think about the excitement which we breeded all the research about vaccines. These are all public goods. Now, once again, public goods used to be something which literally came in the last chapter of the book. It's now front and center in economics. We know right across the various fields that these so-called uncompensated external effects, in this case benefits, are an important part of the economics that we now teach to our grad students, and Wendy and I are trying to make sure that also gets taught at the intro level. Now, I think it's the case that economics responded pretty well to the pandemic, and part of that has been because most economists, at least most research economists, have abandoned the idea that you can represent the economy as a set of amoral, self-interested people interacting solely via contracts in competitive markets and excluding external effects. That idea is gone in economics. Nobody thinks that, and no one teaches that to their grad students. And unfortunately, that's still what we hear from journalists and political leaders and so on. That's what we have to change, and Wendy and I think we can do it.
So the battle for the narrative, how we speak about the economy, is already underway. And you can see here in this quote from The Economist, one aspect of this. So they say, big government is needed to fight the pandemic, but what matters is how it shrinks back afterwards. A pandemic government is not fit for everyday life. Another side of the argument, the Financial Times, says something rather different. Radical reforms, reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades, will need to be put on the table. And they say governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. So this new narrative that we're going to be talking about this afternoon is going to involve more than just a to and fro about the role of markets and the role of government. We think it may bring in a third pole, that of what we could think of as community or civil society. And look here at these volunteers who are pulling carts full of food donations in London. And what we're going to be arguing is that economics has got the goods to allow us to expand the space for discussing policies, for designing policies, for implementing them, by drawing on ethical motivations of solidarity and duty that underpin community and go beyond this one-dimensional line, if you like, with the state and the market. So with compliance at one side and material gain as the motivation at the other side. And what the pandemic's done is it's really drawn attention to how the economy operates in very different ways from just thinking about prices, buying and selling, and markets. So here we've got the Department for Education in the UK actually making a list of essential workers. And if you look through the list here, you can see that these are often poorly paid workers. And we've seen not only their goodwill being called upon, but we've also seen lots of examples of ethical, generous behavior and reliance on social norms, compliance with social norms that list of countries that Bloomberg put together and that Sam showed earlier on, when you look through that list, you can see that trust, compliance, these kind of norms have been crucial to understanding successful response to the pandemic. These things are absent from the conventional economics paradigm. But we have to be careful about what kind of words we're using. And we're going to talk about narrative. What we mean by that is a particular way of explaining or understanding events. So if we take an example of the social democratic or New Deal narrative, then the sort of stories, the way that that was explained was things like the Great Depression occurred because workers weren't paid enough to buy all the goods that they produced. There's something that goes along with those stories, and this is the vernacular or the everyday speech around the sofa or the kitchen table, where people would talk, if we think about the neoliberal vernacular, saying things like there's no such thing as society, or that labor unions are just special interest groups. And what we're going to try and do is to construct for you a way of thinking about how economics can contribute to what we think of as a policy paradigm. And what we're going to do is to talk about 4 different levels. So at the base are the ethical commitments. On that base is the economic model. Then, in order to implement the ethical commitments on the basis of the economic understanding, are policies, and then it has to be talked about, discussed, stories have to develop. So if we think about this in terms of classical liberalism, then we could think about equal dignity as being one of the key values, and then the economic model that implements that has features like the division of labor, specialization, comparative advantage. And then we have the policies like abolishing the Corn Laws, the end of chartered monopolies. And how do people talk about it? Well, just as Alice said to the Queen, it's all done by everyone minding their own business. So the new narrative we are going to argue is that isn't limited to this single continuum where we've got motivations in terms of material incentives in markets, or motivations in terms of compliance with state authority at the other end of the spectrum. And what we mean by here, by the poles at each end, is that it refers to both the institutions or the rules of the game and those motivations and social norms that make the rules work well. So just think about 2 policies. If we're thinking about climate policies, carbon tax and dividend, or cap and trade, we can place them on this line. One is closer to the market end, the other is closer to the government end. And they're using the complementarity of state capacity and market mechanisms to deliver the desired outcome. The narrative's changed before. So what we're trying to suggest is that it can change again, that COVID has given it a push, that we need to push it much harder given the challenges of the climate crisis. But if we think about the last time, or a time last century when it really changed, was as an outcome of the Great Depression and the Second World War. So what happened here was this shift along that single dimension from markets to governments, when Roosevelt said that heedless self-interest is bad economics, and that out of that set of new values, a new model came, a new narrative and a vernacular, which was brought to the classroom in Paul Samuelson's famous 1948 textbook, Economics. So it's COVID-19 and climate change, which we think provide the opportunity for a similar shift. So we're going to move beyond this this simple continuum, and the reason that we're able to do it in the economics that's been developed over the past few decades really centers on the informational and behavioral revolutions that have taken place.
Well, when we think of what economics has to offer and what we may have learned, we can think about COVID as kind of like out of sample forecasting or something like that. There are a whole bunch of new ideas in economics that have really been very widespread among researchers. I think COVID has actually made more prominent some of these truths. The first is that good laws and good incentives are no substitute for good citizens. Now, you think that sounds like a new idea. Well, actually, the Nobel Prizes in 2007 were given for 3 mechanism designers. The primary result of their work was exactly to show that there's a whole set of problems in which no matter how clever the mechanism is, that is the rules of the game or subsidies or whatever, you cannot achieve efficient outcomes if people are self-interested without coercing them. And I mean, that's big news in economics. Then we have to start thinking about preferences. Well, another piece of good news here is that if social preferences are required to have a well-governed society, there's plenty of evidence from behavioral economics that good citizens are not scarce. 3 decades of research in behavioral economics around the world shows that a substantial fraction of people in our subject pools of our experiments are either reciprocal or altruistic or fair-minded or some combination of the 3. There are self-interested people in the experiments that we've done, but they're typically a minority. And finally, a bit of a cautionary tale. One thing we also know is that our concern about others, which often takes positive forms like altruism and reciprocity, also takes the form of hostility towards outsiders and tribalism and so on. So that the idea that human beings naturally look beyond themselves and take account of what other people are experiencing is not entirely good news, because it leads to the possibility of the outsider hostility. Now, these reach beyond academic issues. If we look at, let's think about what we've learned about politics. I mean, think about Brexit, think about US politics and so on. We've learned that I think that people care deeply about issues like dignity, identity, community, autonomy, and so on. What people care about goes way beyond simply a slogan, a good slogan like inclusive prosperity. Now, let's look at the most famous quote from The Wealth of Nations. You'll see this is I copied this from my copy of The Wealth of Nations, and you can see as an undergrad, I dutifully highlighted that part with double lines next to it. It is the most commonly quoted. It's not, this is from Adam Smith, where it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. That's fantastic. I learned that, everybody learned that, everybody quotes it. I didn't read on. What would I have read had I read on? The next thing that Adam Smith said is, nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly on the benevolence of his fellow citizens. What? That famous quote about self-interest was showing that market interactions are a good thing because they allow equal dignity. There's nothing about efficiency there. It's about a society which would award to everyone the status of being an equal citizen and equally dignified. Now, making these concerns, Wendy and I are convinced that identity, community, autonomy, dignity should be a central part of the normative framework of any new paradigm in economics. making it central to an economics paradigm will be a challenge, and that's what we'd like to turn to now.
Okay, so if we're thinking about the fact that we need to build a successful new policy paradigm, then how should we think about this? So as I sketched before, we have to think about it in terms of these 4 different levels. And I'm just going to take the example of neoliberalism. So if we're thinking about what we're trying to do now is to displace that prevailing paradigm with a new one. Then let's look at the normative foundations of neoliberalism. It's all about freedom from government interference, about procedural justice, the idea that fair rules define fair outcomes. And that knits very closely together with the economic model built on self-interested individuals and government officials and their interaction in competitive markets. Out of that is produced wholly coherent policies with the values and with the model, such as school vouchers, negative income tax, and the like. And then the way it's talked about is in terms of the government that governs best, governs least. So that's what we're up against. That's what we have to do. We have to construct this 4-fold basis for a new paradigm.
Wendy introduced the neoliberalism in part just to show what we mean by the 4 aspects of a new paradigm. But I also think we can learn a lot from the origins of neoliberalism and their huge success, for example, with the Mount Pelerin Society. An important thing to understand about the success of neoliberalism is it wedded a particular view of philosophy and of economics. So there was that unity of those 2 ideas. But it went beyond that. Wendy, could you advance the slide? Often when people talk about neoliberalism, the success of neoliberalism is somehow ascribed to, there's all this right-wing think tanks and so on. I think that's a big mistake. There was some very good economics that was contributed by people like Buchanan, Becker, Hayek, Friedman, and others. It's important to understand that what they contributed was synergistic with the norms that they put forward. Now, in our thinking about what a new paradigm would look like, we think a starting point has to be that we should challenge the idea that our normative frame is exhausted by the 3 terms liberty, fairness, and efficiency. There are other things that we might be concerned about. But that restricted normative domain actually has a long history in economics, and let's see what we can do to displace that or to challenge its foundations. Economics has been seen, the economy has been seen as what we call a morality-free zone, with a couple of caveats. Here's the philosopher David Gautier. The presumption of free activity in a competitive market ensures that no one is subject to any form of compulsion or any type of limitation not already affecting her actions as a solitary individual. Thus, morality has no application to market interactions under the conditions of perfect competition. Well, there you go. It's like a foreign embassy or something. You can go in there and escape the norms of the surrounding territory. It's basically, as we put it, a morality-free zone. It's not too surprising hearing this from David Gautier, who's considered to be a conservative. This is Kenneth Arrow. Kenneth Arrow, a left-of-center economist, saying the same thing. Any complaints about the market system and the market system's operation can be reduced to complaints about the distribution of income. The price system itself determines the distribution of income only in the sense of preserving the status quo. Well, basically, what Arrow says, and he deeply cared about equality and justice, but aside from concerns about distributive justice, prices will do the work of morals. We don't need to worry about morality in the market except for the question of justice. Now that's an impoverished normative framework. Consider, for example, letting prices do the work of morals. These women are at a meatpacking plant in the United States. As you know, meatpacking plants around the world have been hotspots for the spread of the COVID pandemic. These people had no choice but to go to work. Their lives depended on it. Some people would consider requiring people to risk their lives in this way to be, first, it's obviously a private exercise of power. There's no question that requiring those women to work when they didn't want to was an exercise of power. Many people would think that it violates democratic norms and as such is an abuse of power. It's interesting why this doesn't come up in economics. Why isn't the power of the employer over the worker part of how we see the economy? Well, interestingly, as Wendy said earlier, what's missing from economics, the standard part that's taught in economics courses until recently, was the idea that economics is limited. Because we have limited information, our contracts are limited. A lot of what goes on in the exchange between the employer of these women in the meatpacking plant and those women doesn't have to do with any contract at all. It has to do with threats and orders. And if you don't do this, don't come in next week. Interestingly, the people who altered economics include Hayek and Coase, associated with University of Chicago and conservative economics. They also include Herbert Simon and other people. Now, there was a time when power, the exercise of power, was recognized as an important part of economic theory. Again, here, Ronald Coase was the innovator on this a long time ago. He described the contract which actually exists between the meatpacking women and their employers. The character of the contract is that the worker, for a certain remuneration, agrees to obey the directions of the employer. Now, if that's not political, I don't know what is. I mean, this just says that those women gave over the right to make certain choices over what they do with their lives and their bodies and so on to the employer. So clearly the firm is a political organization. Now, how did that basic idea by a very prominent economist, won a Nobel Prize partly for that work, how did that idea get shoved off the table? Well, interestingly, the idea is complete contracts. Economics has assumed that what goes on in every transaction is a complete contract. So everything is contracted for. And as Oliver Hart, another economist, said, what does it mean to put somebody in charge of an action or a decision if all the actions can be specified in a contract? If everything is in the contract, there's no reason I have to order you to do anything. It's already contracted. If you don't do the right thing, I call 911 and enforce the contract. So it's not a question of power between me and you. It's already in the contract. Now, a supporting role in this has been the idea of market clearing. Supply equals demand. Well, if supply equals demand in the labor market, what that means is the women in the meatpacking plant had nothing to worry about, because if they got fired from the meatpacking plant, they could go across the street and get another job. So the apparent power that the employer has over workers is just actually a fiction because of the complete contracts. First, there's no power, there's nothing to exercise power over because it's already in the contract. And secondly, even if they did threaten the worker, that would be a toothless threat because of market clearing, which is what supply equals demand means. Now, surprisingly, this bizarre idea that employers don't exercise power over workers became standard economics. Look at this textbook passage from a very prominent textbook of the last century. One could call the employee the boss because he orders the employee, one could call the employee the boss because he orders the employer to pay him a specific sum if he wants services performed. But words are words. So it doesn't really matter who's called the employer and who's called the boss, because the boss is just a fiction. Now, this had huge consequences for how we talked about economics. For example, think about the following. Think about advocating worker rights, individual rights of workers to refuse to do certain kind of activities on the job or to engage in certain kinds of speech and so on. Now, advocating that kind of extension of individual rights to workers in an environment in which economics has taught us that there's no power of employer over workers in the first place, so there's no political structure of that firm to be democratized, or that would be like, imagine this. You want to advocate for unemployment insurance, but Keynes never happened, so no one had ever heard about aggregate demand. Well, then you would be robbed of any argument about how unemployment insurance would be an automatic stabilizer. Or imagine advocating a libertarian stance towards the government, if you're a neoliberal, and Adam Smith's invisible hand had never been invented. That'd be kind of tough. Well, the fact that economics, until recently, failed to recognize the power of the workplace has disarmed people from recognizing what's called the private government of the firm. And here, a prominent economist could write, without controversy, an economic transaction is a solved political problem. Economics has gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. I wonder if we asked those women in the meatpacking plant if they thought their relationship with the employer was a solved political problem. Now, in the real economy, the domain of complete contracts was never very large, and it appears to be shrinking. Now, look at our economy today. We have, in the United States, only 1 in 7 workers is producing a thing. Everyone else is producing a service of some kind: care, knowledge production, leisure activity, personal security, and so on. Think about those jobs being, for example, a guard, or taking care of the elderly, or taking care of kids, or serving in a restaurant, or being a medical researcher, and so on. There's those jobs, what they're doing, you can't write a contract for them. Those jobs have to be done by people who have an intrinsic desire to get the job done. And if they don't have that kind of intrinsic desire, then they're run on the basis, if you lack social norms to get a good job done, you have to run that on threats of termination and so on. Now, so let's think about what the new economics, and I'm talking since the 80s, really. All of these relationships are now depicted as a relationship between a principal, like an employer or a lender, and an agent, a borrower or an employee. The principal exercises power over the agent. That's, as I say, uncontroversial in microeconomics. This power can be abused, for example, in sexual harassment at no cost to the principal. No controversy there either. Social norms such as truth-telling, reciprocity, work motivation, and so on are essential to getting the job done, and to, in fact, even allowing an exchange to take place. And finally, the allocations that result from this kind of setup are always Pareto inefficient. Very special cases have to be created to get an efficiency argument out of this. Now, this is the new economics of work. What do we get from that? Well, let's think about it. If the principal has power over the agent, then Wendy, could you advance the slide? If the principal has power over the agent, we could ask, well, should this power be accountable? I mean, typically, for example, we expect our local governments to be accountable to the citizens. They may not have a lot of power, but they have some, and so then we elect them and so on. Shouldn't we apply the same kinds of reasoning to the kinds of powers that employers exercise? Power can be abused. Well, shouldn't we consider having stronger individual rights at work to enhance the dignity and equal status, not only defensive against such things as racial insults or sexual harassment, but also positive things such as speech rights in the workplace? The fact that social norms are important to getting the job done, essential to getting the job done in the new economy of caring and knowledge production and distribution. How are we going to have social norms of intrinsic motivation, reciprocity, and so on? How will those survive when we have high levels of inequality and hierarchy in the workplace? So we may have to think about providing a situation, a condition in which the norms that we rely on to get the job done can be cultivated and mobilized. And finally, the fact that those allocations are inefficient means that some of the things that I said about addressing these problems could actually be efficiency enhancing. That is, there needn't be a cost to going down this road. Well, let's think about, Wendy? Our thought about a paradigm is the following. The ethical values in the model have to be complementary. That's true, but it has to be a property of the model and the ethics that if you pursue those ethical goals, then in the model of the economy that you're talking about, the economy will work better. And that's an important part of reforming those relationships of power within the workplace. We think that that can be done. It's also important that the model of the economy has to bear some resemblance to what really is out there in the world. And that's where we think that, for example, the neoliberal model has failed, and that's not going to be the model of the future because it so clearly doesn't reflect what's going on out there.
So let's take this setup of the combination of a whole new set of ideas in economics and how they can be put together to construct the foundations of what we see as a new paradigm. So the idea is that we've got to move from this one-dimensional structure between markets on the one side and government on the other and ask what's missing. So we're going to call this civil society, and we're going to argue that the ability for economists to be part of this debate has been laid by the new economic theories that Sam has set out. And it turns out that COVID is a very good test case for thinking about this third pole, civil society or community. But it seems to provide the essential elements of a strategy to kill the virus without killing the economy. These are the new elements that Sam has set out: the limits of private contract and government fiat, the fact that people really can have very different motivations from the ones that were stressed in the neoliberal paradigm. So let's have a look at this triangle. What we've got is this third pole, and we've got different motivations: the motivations of reciprocity, altruism, fairness, sustainability. As Sam said, this is not some warm, fuzzy place. It's also where we have to think about identity, tribalism. And if we pick a location inside the space, say X marks the spot, then a policy there located at X, you can see represents a combination that's closest to the markets pole, the markets vertex, with less influence from civil society. What about taking a point Y? A policy located there weights the motivations of compliance and reciprocity or sustainability pretty equally, with less weight on material incentives. So if we put some of the world into the triangle, then we can see that a whole range of institutions and policies can't be even talked about on the one-dimensional space. So think of kidney exchanges, think of care work at home, think, as Sam was stressing, of the relationships, the power relationships within conventional firms, or of open source software, or what we're doing, which is the advancement of science. That has to rely on social norms of peer review, respect for the ethics of the scientific method, and so on. So that without its new tools, economics was really excluded from being able to characterize these crucial components of the paradigm which we need to respond to the challenges that we're now facing. Let's test this by thinking about COVID-19. Along the markets government, okay, along that one-dimensional line, then we see perfectly conventional things like the reallocation of labor, Amazon hiring, Qantas firing, those fired workers being hired by the government as contact tracers. We see at the government pole is the push that happened where the government's ability to bear the risk in a crisis like a pandemic was brought to the fore. But inside the triangle, inside that space, is where we see the things that really differentiate the performance across countries in their ability to manage the pandemic. And very much in debate at the moment is obviously the organizations that have produced the research that will produce the production and distribution of vaccines. So we're going to be using a combination of the motivations of markets, state capacity, as well as those of civil society. And we can see that how that's played out through each of those phases in the production of the vaccine. So COVID is a great test case, I think, for how far economics has come and is able to provide us with the tools to confront these challenges. But what about the next challenge, where we don't have a vaccine, where we can't self-isolate from climate change? And we can, one thing that we can do is to think about this in terms of what is the most pressing issue that economists should be addressing. And we've taken this question into classrooms all around the world now. And this is the response of students just over a year ago in my university. So there they were putting the problem of climate change and inequality as the most pressing issues that economists should be addressing. What we've done is to show that economists have the tools now to engage with those problems. Here is the word cloud from students, 3,500 students this year. So it's inequality, sustainability, climate change, and COVID, where students are calling for action of economists to address these problems. And a response to this that Craig mentioned in the introduction has been in a project that is firmly located towards the bottom of that triangle. So this is the core project, which is now transforming economics education. It's a global collaboration of researchers giving their time to create free online material. And it's bringing 3 innovations. It's bringing a new benchmark. So it's bringing that new economics into the classroom so that students are not frustrated and dissatisfied that when they're studying economics, they're not able to address those crucial problems that they identify. It's a novel way of producing and distributing knowledge. It's open science. And it's offering a new pedagogy to transform who economists are, not white men in suits, and how they learn. So this just gives you a taste of the new benchmark. So we don't just have people characterized as Homo economicus interacting with each other. The economy is part of the biosphere. Its sustainability is in question. So that right-hand column there is the benchmark based on the new economics, and that's one that we can bring to students. So if you want to look at the material that's been produced, and everything's freely available, and to see a new pedagogy of active learning. Here, this is related to the COVID pandemic. And what we've done is we've created a simulation that you can play with. You can look at the disease transmission, so those interactions that Sam was talking about right at the beginning. And we've overlaid on that disease transmission network the economic interactions, the gains from trade that arise between people's interactions. If you compare what happens to the course of the disease with no mitigation, with a situation where we have social distancing, then we can see the epidemic is has a lower peak and is shorter lived. So you can explore these simulations for yourself. You can compare the economic cost So there's a bigger initial hit if we're breaking the economic ties to control the disease, but the pandemic is over more quickly. And in this simulation, you can see that the effect on inequality is more muted in the case with social distancing. So this is economics in action. It's bringing the new economics to students, to in fact everyone who wants to engage with it. And we've also got some additional sources that you can pursue these, where you can pursue these ideas. So we're really looking forward to the discussion, and I'll hand back to Craig now.
Thanks very much to both of you, Wendy and Sam. Terrific presentation. And in dark times, it leaves me feeling a little bit more optimistic. I want to ask one question of my own, which you can file away to answer in due course, and then call on our three discussants in alphabetical order as they're listed in the program. My question is simply whether the project of the last 50 years amounts to seeing the economy as much more autonomous from society or other dimensions of society, as you've outlined, and therefore making economics more autonomous from other fields of inquiry than is ideal. So I would welcome your thoughts on whether there are going to be new and different connections between economists and other social and behavioral scientists, and maybe in this COVID and climate change era, natural and physical scientists. Many of the core ideas you talk about renewing in economics have long been core themes for sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, historians, and so forth. With no more from me, let me just introduce the three panelists, and I'll tell you briefly who they are as we start. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard and director of the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics, and she'll go first. Danielle, over to you.
Thanks so much, Craig. Thank you, Wendy and Sam. I mean, this is just incredibly exciting work. As you know, I have found it just really inspiring and helpful. I want to affirm the point about starting with ethics and the fact that it is possible to revise political economy from that starting point. I think the set of ethical values that you have is right and good. In the work of my own research network, we have 6 that are really just different words for the same things that you're talking about. Non-domination, which we understand is the absence of exclusionary access to or ownership of social institutions, and the preservation of individual rights in authoritarian institutions like firms. Political equality, meaning equal participation and standing in the political process, and the notion that the economy needs to support that. Freedom to pursue personal opportunity within a private property regime that can restrict possibility and choice. Anti-monopoly, meaning the absence of authoritarian and exclusionary market structures. Egalitarian pluralism, ensuring that people have control over their own lives, relationships, identities, and value differences that make these conditions meaningful to them. And community, referring to the levels of common fate that form the building blocks of a just political economy, cities, regions, nations, the globe, when addressing questions of ecological sustainability, financial sustainability, and even social sustainability. So really it's the same set of ethical grounds. And as we've tried to develop that into a vernacular economics in your vocabulary, we've ended up focusing on linking 2 basic concepts, good jobs and corporate purpose. And the question in substance is, can the whole paradigm be subsumed under that? That is, that's what policymaking apparatus should be directed towards. That's what firms should be directed towards. A question there when I sort of put together good jobs and corporate purpose, and I should say too, when I think of corporate purpose, thinking of both questions of governance inside corporations and the issue of competition policy and how we improve that. But if I put together good jobs and corporate purpose, typically in the conversations that we have in the worlds of policy and business, as opposed to the science of economics, corporate purpose is sort of linked to what we think of as, corporations in the sort of sense of Fortune 500 companies, the most influential multinational firms. and small businesses tend to drop out of the picture. So this is a really nitty-gritty question, but it's really one of, if the paradigm is good jobs and corporate purpose, can that concept be expanded to be firm purpose in a way that brings in small businesses? Or putting it differently, where do small businesses fit into a revised picture of policymaking in the vernacular economics that flows from your economic theory?
Thanks, Danielle. Terrific questions and comments. And we are asking Sam and Wendy to take them on board. And hear now from Jyoti Ghosh, who's the chair of the Center for Economic Sciences and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and very appropriately, the author of the book After Crisis, Adjustment, Recovery, and Fragility, which looked at South Asia a decade ago. Jyoti.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be able to discuss this really insightful, and I would also agree, very exciting presentation from Sam and Wendy. I also just want to mention that I'm actually no longer at JNU, and I will be joining University of Massachusetts at Amherst, which I'm really very honored to be joining a department that Sam was so instrumental in creating. No, so this is really, as I said, it's a very exciting way of looking at it. And I'm also grateful for the optimism about the economics discipline, which we don't get much of nowadays, to be honest. But in that spirit, I would argue that while these, the informational and behavioral revolutions that were mentioned, are definitely major advances on the kinds of economics that were happening, let's say, even 3 decades ago, I don't think they're enough. I think we need even more change. And perhaps fundamental change in the way that we are looking at economies. And I'm going to take basically 3 points, 2 of them completely based on the idea of power and relational power that has been expressed so neatly and forcefully in your presentation and in the work that you've done otherwise. The first is really about relational power impacting on economic processes and relationships in both paid and unpaid form, through various social norms. So what happens when it's not only about reciprocity and community and all the good stuff, but it's also about the exercise of private power within families, patriarchy, within communities. In India, caste would be the very big thing, within other sorts of areas. So what happens when what is seen as morality and ethics in particular cultures is actually reinforcing power inequalities that work in the opposite way, shall we say, from those of solidarity and community and so on. So that's one question. And the second is a kind of extension of this to, if you like, the international economy, to the global economy. And here again, I believe power is of the essence. International economic arrangements are strongly impacted by international power imbalances. And there, I think it's very interesting, the point you make about how community can really be a double-edged sword, right? It can also lead to tribalism. And if you think of tribalism in different ways, you could think of it as a form of nationalism, for example. We see so many ways in which the global architecture is defined by these power imbalances, and they determine, for example, the way in which sovereign debt issues are resolved in the global economy, the way in which tax cooperation that is so easy and is such low-hanging fruit for all governments does not occur. Today, we see it in the way the vaccines are being, the purchase of vaccines is being preempted by certain governments, despite the existence of a community-based COVAX alliance, which is trying to make it distributed on a more fair basis. So really, I would argue that we have to think about the power imbalances at the very micro level, if you like, but also internationally, and how those then play out in terms of how we would even formulate the economics and the economic policies that we are going to do to address the pandemic and the post-pandemic situation. And finally, I think, there is this is not something you touch on really, but it's a very important issue, I believe, in the economics discipline, which is that we're still stuck in the concepts of the mid-20th century in terms of things like GDP and productivity. These were developed for a very different time, goosenets, etc. It was a very different context, and they are no longer fit for purpose. GDP, we all know, mismeasures dramatically, but it's also deeply conceptually flawed. Productivity, we're always using as GDP per worker, which is terrible because we are wrongly estimating the numerator and we're underestimating the denominator because we don't take into account unpaid work, which is massive, especially in developing countries. And it really, even now we're talking about a recovery. Typically, everyone in the world is using GDP as the indicator for recovery, even when we shouldn't. We are talking, when we relate to the environment, we debate green growth versus degrowth, once again using GDP as the conceptual basis. I think we have to move beyond that, and that requires the same kind of imaginative work that you have brought in to looking at the processes within national economies. So yeah, let me stop there. Thanks.
Okay, great questions, Jadi. This discussion is getting richer and richer. And now let me turn to Luc Souete, who is the honorary professor of international economics and former rector magnificus of Maastricht University. I have great sympathy for anyone who has been a university president and also remained the kind of productive intellectual that Luc Souete has. He was the founder of the Maastricht Economic Research Institute on Innovation and Technology, and is known for a variety of kinds of work, including one theme that remains important today, the question of taxing electronic transactions, and various other IT questions in economics. Luc?
Thanks very much. Let me move a little bit further and move in the direction of the dynamics of what Sam and Wendy just presented. And I think this moving away from the government market access into these non-market social interactions, as they've put it. And I think, of course, they raise much more fundamental issues about democracy, ethics, values, freedom, which I won't address here, but let me focus on following on a little bit from what Yayati mentioned just a minute ago. And that is the way COVID-19 really impacts in a very direct way on what I would say the dominance of the growth paradigm within economics. Referring back to the old slogan of it's the economy, stupid. I think that slogan has really gone out of the door with COVID-19. And you could say today, maybe it's well-being stupid, which would include all the things Yayati mentioned just about GDP, including mental health, including well-being in much more broader senses, etc. And I think this is really where climate change, which already, remember Greta Thunberg's reference to it's the economy, it's stupid by taking out the word economy and changing it with planet. But I think with COVID-19, you have to take it out and involve much more other things, including aspects of well-being, mental health, and many others. And I think this is really where, from a more macroeconomic perspective, the debate about growth and the way the discussion about distribution has dominated the whole debate and the axis between markets and government, as presented by Sam and Wendy, is really, I would say, one has avoided the discussions about going left or right in the sense of the distributional issues by growth, and using growth, which was always predicting then that a future would have a higher quality of life expectancy, higher, better living conditions, new scientific discoveries, improved technologies, and hence also higher productivity growth and higher income was always something by which growth was used as the way of expanding the economy by simply postponing distributional issues. And I think the contribution I wanted to make, which I've also put on slides, but not presenting here because of time, is really opposite to, say, the shrinking capitalism of Wendy and Sam in terms of the continuous, well, the limited number of contracts, of really contractual arrangements, etc. I would put forward the expanding capitalism in terms of the continuous push towards satisfying continuously new material wants. And you observe this also not just at the level of governance, but at the level of firms. In firms, typically also the way firms will grow is by raising profitability through what I've called a form of destructive creation innovation, that is to say, to continuously wreck the stock of value in existing consumer goods by bringing up new consumer goods, a new version of a particular good, whether that's a game model or whether that's an iPhone or whatever. And in this sense, you continuously move into a direction of growth as the solution to increase your continuous profitability rather than prices, etc. So from this perspective, my line would really be to push Sam and Wendy in a direction of saying, look, if you look at COVID and the impact of COVID, you observe a number of really big changes in terms, and I assume here I take for granted that COVID is the first of a pandemic which, despite vaccines, might be repeated in new pandemics with new viruses emerging, of course, including climate crisis. As a continuous set of crises emerging, you will see that there are continuous also creative destruction processes of changes. And I find it remarkable how changes in the organizational setup have affected our economies. And let me raise three specifically. The reduction in commuting with remote work. And the question to Sam and Wendy is in this remote work environment, is the workplace still the one which you describe in terms of the power of a principal-agent relationship of authority? Or do you have now a very different workplace at home, somewhere else possibly, with very different relationships? So are social norms and ethics entering into the remote workplace in a different way than they would be under the traditional non-existing contract or difficulties of contractual arrangement? And if you enlarge this and you look at services and, for instance, also delivery, look at the very different growths in delivery of all sorts of goods and services. Think of the dark kitchens and the various other ways in which new delivery and new organizational forms are being set up. Again, to what extent do they destroy existing retail and catering firms, but at the same time raise new kind of forms of organizational authority and principal agent relationships? And finally, our own sector, our own relationships, we as what I would call knowledge workers, are we going to have webinars like this in a physical future? I don't think so. I think that we realize the efficiency of being able to communicate like this, to have questions on the chat function, to see our persons only in the eyes, but that's about it. But at the same time, we don't need the physical presence for these kind of discussions. So in the whole knowledge work environment, we for sure move to much more remote contacts, remote interactions, by which we become effectively much more productive in a sense of having much more time to spend in different webinars discussing various different issues. So I would say that there are a lot of issues in the paper of Sam and Wendy. And I think that to conclude, I think the local regional dimensions is possibly what brings together climate and pandemic in that sense. So I would conclude by saying that I agree, ultimately, while I'm probably, I would side when Wendy listed that duality between the Economist and the Financial Times, I would certainly side on the Financial Times to say that the forgotten role of the state in infrastructure, investment in healthcare, in public research funding. Think of Mariana Mazzucato's lines about missions, that in education, that all this will increase under COVID and future crisis, but that we, precisely because we are not all in this together in the same way, it will lead to a much more stronger emphasis on local and regional ways in which the crisis affect the local communities. And I think that's what is really common between, I would argue, COVID and climate crisis and future crisis, is the global nature of the crisis, but the local implementation or the local, say, infection of those crises in a very different way, depending on local environments. And then I join, of course, their view on how local activities and the value of local activities are growing in such a crisis environment.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Luc. The plan now is to give Wendy and Sam a brief opportunity to take up whichever of these questions most stimulates them, but feel no obligation to answer the whole list of all the questions, because we'd like to have a bit of conversation among all the panelists now. Indeed, Wendy or Sam may want to ask questions of Danielle, Jayati, or Luke, and we can go in various directions, and I'll do my best to moderate this discussion. So, Wendy, Sam?
Maybe just to start, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
No, you go, Wendy.
So I was just going to kind of quickly go to Craig's first question, which was really like the framing question of the disciplines and where is economics relative to other disciplines and other sciences. And I think that you said the project of the last 50 years was to seeing economics as separate from other disciplines. And I think that really what's happened in economics in the last 30 or 40 years is to bring economics back away from this sort of arrogant position as the queen of the social sciences, because it was dealing with solved political problems, to being exactly not that. So that economics has, by being able to develop the tools from within economics, but being stimulated by the data and the questions from other social sciences, I think is a genuine social science again, or at its best is a genuine social science. And to the extent that it's also recognizing the need to incorporate the normative dimension, it's also in discussion with philosophy in a way that was lost in the middle of the last century. So that's why I think we really do have an optimistic message about the drawing of insights from other disciplines and pushing our students, for example, out into those other disciplines to learn from them and to come back and develop their questions in economics with that much richer background. So,
okay, over to Sam.
No longer out in the cold.
I noted your extreme politeness in deferring to each other, and this heralds a new era of modest economists, I think.
I'd like to add to what Wendy said. Everybody thinks it's a good idea to be interdisciplinary. It's no longer just a good idea. The economics that we're putting forward, those principal agent models, make it a requirement. If you want to understand how wages are set, we're not talking about religion or families or whatever that sociologists should be consulted about. No, we're talking about setting prices and setting wages require us to think about the exercise of power and social norms in the workplace. So in other words, it's no longer elective to become good at thinking about politics and society and referring to the insights of anthropologists and biologists and others. And it's part of becoming a good economist. And that's what we're arguing in the way we're teaching our intro courses and so on. And I think that's where economics is going to have to go. And by the way, we're not think of, like, George Akerlof has been using psychology and anthropological insights for 20 or 30 years to provoke him to think about other stuff and then use those insights, like cognitive dissonance, like gift exchange, and so on. It's already happening.
Yeah, well, I'm encouraged.
I want to say something about your thing, Danielle.
Please talk to Danielle because she's about to leave.
Oh,
No,
well,
I apologize.
Don't leave before I say something great about you. I love the way you say because basically you're intervening in a public debate in the best way possible. I mean, you're a very sophisticated thinker about the stuff you're doing, but you're also thinking bumper stickers. And that vernacular, I mean, you want good jobs and corporate purpose to be part of everyday language.
That's right.
Of the economy. And I'm not sure that's my bumper sticker, but something like that. And you can tell Wendy and I are trying to do the same thing. I mean, to have things that make sense at the philosophical and economic level that can be translated into something that's going to be evocative. You asked about small businesses. I think a very key element in both small businesses and the gig economy is we can't make those jobs in those businesses be decent unless people have a decent fallback position. That is, we have to make sure that people have something which is not that particular job that they get if they get kicked out or lose the job and so on. And this is especially the case in the gig economy. So I think we really should think about the what you get if you're not in this job as a very good way of improving that job. We mentioned also something about rights on the job, and we mean everything from individual rights to power sharing on the job, and those things can apply in smaller places as well. By the way, I think there's some role also for letting prices do some work here. That is, obviously on environmental issues and so on, a carbon tax would be a tremendous advantage because it would affect prices, and then there would be a shift in people's priorities. So Wendy and I are not against letting prices be a part of a package. It's just not as assigning the only role to prices.
Terrific. No, thank you. That's a super helpful response. And I just want to affirm
just keep it up. I just love what you're doing.
Well, likewise, we're definitely pulling in the same directions. And I just want to affirm too the instinct of everybody here that the COVID crisis has really accelerated this conversation. I am seeing recognition everywhere, and in sort of vernacular contexts of new formulations for talking about the economy. So it is a transformative moment, and we're very lucky to have your work to help us all crystallize that moment of transformation. So I'm sorry that I have to sign off, but thanks so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, Danielle, for being with us. And let's continue the conversation, sadly losing Danielle. And let me offer to you, who has something to say next?
I wanted to say something in response to Jyoti, your third point about in a sense, the measurement issues. And I think that you're absolutely right about this. And I also think there's pretty widespread agreement that that the focus on GDP was, and if you think where it came from, it came out of the Depression, when it actually turned out to be really important to measure the flow. Okay, so that measuring the flow of income and expenditure was crucial. So the idea of the business cycle and what was needed to replace the lost injections into the flow from private spending. So that's why GDP emerged, and all the effort was made to measure it in a standardized way. But once we recognize that the problems are so different, then that particular measurement becomes anachronistic. And I think there's a lot of really good work being done on creating measures of sometimes called inclusive wealth. So the whole point is that you have to move to a stock measure of natural capital, human capital, physical capital, so that that's for our current problems. And obviously climate crisis is particularly putting us under pressure to make those measures the ones that we really focus on. So I think there's no disagreement there. There's a sort of the GDP became something that everyone measured, and it became standardized. And what we have to do is to make that same big move to much more appropriate measures for the problems that we face.
And I think we should start with the idea that it should measure something like well-being, and like as you said, Luke. I'd also like to pick up a couple of things you said. The idea that the idea of growth allowed economists and everybody else who bought the model to essentially avoid considering distribution, because essentially growth will take care of that. Now, yes, that's right, but it's also true that the idea of complete contracts serves the same role. The myth that we have complete contracts allows us to not think about distribution. Why is that? If you have complete contracts, you can treat your workers pretty badly and still get them to work because they have to, because it's in the contract. If you have incomplete contracts, you automatically have to take account of how are you going to cultivate an environment within which the job is going to get done? Well, the first casualty, if you're thinking about that, is going to be inequality, or at least massive inequalities, because you can't have a cooperative organization in which people are all working on the same project, intrinsically motivated to do stuff, which is highly inegalitarian. So in the same way, I think as we think about what is it about economics that has allowed us to ignore, as Craig said, interdisciplinarity, as you said, issues of distribution and other normative concerns, I think we should really just, because that's what we have to do in constructing a new paradigm, one that doesn't have those barriers that allow people to dismiss important normative concerns. I think, by the way, that remote work it doesn't really fundamentally change the principal-agent relationships. There's still the problem of having your work terminated or and so on. I mean, obviously, it changes a lot about it. There is some research being done now about what is the different role of social preferences in face-to-face work, non-remote and remote work, and there are some changes there. But I think fundamentally, it's still a principal-agent relationship, and the basic opportunities for change that I outlined are still there. Say, Craig, there are a bunch of really great questions.
Yeah, let's channel in a couple of these questions. And do you have one you want to take up?
Yeah.
If not,
well,
I propose.
I have three, which
okay.
Which I'll answer
Why
pretty
don't you
quickly.
do it and name the person asking them?
I'm pulling up the questions now. I have a question from Arthur McEwen.
Good.
And Arthur wanted to ask what the relationship between these paradigms that Wendy and I are talking about and the ownership and top management of large firms. I'm just finding the question now. I know Arthur well enough that I probably could guess what the question is. Yeah, I mean, basically what Arthur says is, what's the relationship of the different paradigms to the ownership of large, powerful firms and manages these firms? He believes that the dominance of the neoliberal paradigm and earlier paradigms serve these interests, and that was large part of explaining their dominance. Absolutely right. And that's a problem, because basically there's going to be opposition to a new paradigm which as part of doing good economics and establishing a democratic a normative framework that challenges the power of those people to essentially wield a kind of power in the workplace and distributional advantages in the rest of society. So to Arthur, I'll say, absolutely, there's going to be some battles that have to be won against very powerful people who have no interest in empowering everybody else and or in their dignity. Stephen Gelb, hi Stephen. Stephen wants to know why are Wendy and I so optimistic? Perhaps it's congenital, but no. And Stephen went on to ask, why do we think that fundamental change is more likely now than in the aftermath of the financial crisis? Excellent question. I think what's happening now has really hit everybody. It's something everyone's talking about, and think of the lessons that we're learning. What did we learn from the financial crisis? Very important stuff about how to manage the financial sector. The Bloomberg list of countries with which Wendy and I started is, oh my God, let's look at all these countries. They're doing stuff differently. And in some places, almost nobody's dying. In some places, 1,000 people are dying a week and or a day even. Now, these are fundamental. I mean, this is, as Wendy said, this is something that's going on around the kitchen table daily. And there's big failures and there's big contrasts. Also, I think economics is a little further along. So I think that this is a different moment. And I mean, Wendy and I think that basically the combination of very high levels of inequality, the pandemic, and the problem of climate change makes this a moment just like the end of the Second World War and the Great Depression, where you have a really different problem. People, all of a sudden, people said, "Oh, governments can do a good thing. Look what we did during the war, and oh, the Great Depression." And then you have an economist like Samuelson coming along and really saying we have to fundamentally change. I hope our optimism is well founded, so far, the core project in economics has been an extraordinary success. And it's amazing to think, I would have thought that it would take decades for us to make inroads in people adopting the core program as a basic intro course, but that hasn't been the case at all. Finally, Elisa Rees, ideas about combating tribalism. This is essential. It's not just going to happen. It has to be an explicit policy. Now, here's the good news. Racial feelings are very susceptible to being modified. The insider-outsider distinctions are pretty fundamental of what people are like. But the fact that they have a racial component is obviously cultural and it's ephemeral. You see this by, for example, modern nationalism, which in many cases has taken people who thought they were fundamentally different and at odds with each other, and in the course of half a century, created Italians out of people who barely understood each other and certainly didn't like each other at all. So I think, ironically, we should take some hope from the experience of modern nationalism, creating people who are willing to sacrifice for each other, pay taxes to help the poor people of some other group and so on a massive scale. But I think it also, I mean, the personal intervention makes a big difference. Calling out racism really makes a big difference. And people have to do that. I'm glad to see it's happening a lot more now.
Can I come back to you, Sam, and ask you to amplify your answer to Arthur McEwen's question a little bit, saying something more about corporations and your idea of corporate purpose and Danielle's comments on that. Does it matter that corporations are not just more powerful or richer, the way that some individuals and maybe more powerful and richer than others, but asymmetrical to human beings, different in kind? And how should we be dealing with that?
Well, I think, I don't think so much about powerful corporations. I probably should think more. What I think about is a powerful class of people. And that is people with substantial wealth. Of course, what they own is corporations and they work primarily through corporations. But the problem is that there's a group of very wealthy people who are both politically and economically powerful in the way that I've outlined. It's called the capitalist class. Now, I think that, I mean, typically in social science, we like to measure things continuously, but I think there are some binary distinctions that really make a lot of sense, particularly when we talk about power and dignity and personal experience and self-determination and so on. Now, so I think that, of course, purposeful corporation is a good idea and so on, and essentially imposing some kind of penalties on the decisions that are hostile to the interests of others and future generations, that's all very important. But I mean, fundamentally, that class of individuals who have really been very dominant in most of the over the paradigms that Wendy described, they're going to have less power because if they have as much power as they have had in the past, then the new paradigm that we're talking about will never get off the ground, and that's just a political battle. And it's a battle which will take place in lots of ways. It won't look like it's a class battle. It'll look like something else in various ways. But fundamentally, it's going to be we're going to have to limit the prerogatives of the very rich.
So can I ask you, or perhaps Wendy, to respond a little more to Luke's questions and point about the local and regional, and how this relates to your account of community and other civil society and other non-economic factors, but also to the organization of economics itself, economies themselves?
Yeah, so I thought this was a really interesting comment, and I think maybe you were stimulated by this as well in the pandemic. So we've really been thinking a lot about cities and about agglomeration economies and all the kinds of ways we understand how innovation takes place in cities. And that's been I think a really important lesson from economics and using a lot of the new concepts that we've been talking about. And in the pandemic, we've had a really new experience, which is that the value of those face-to-face interactions has been undermined, and we've been either chosen or we've been instructed, given guidelines varied across countries to not meet in those settings. And that has raised the question of what's the role of the city in the economy as it goes forward. This obviously interacts with climate as well, as you and many other people have suggested, in simple terms to do with commuting, to do with international meetings, and as you said, the way that science is conducted. But I mean, in some ways, I'd like to kind of turn it back to you and give you a chance to characterize how you think, you know, those two things, right? The importance of cities for innovation on the one hand, and what have we learned from the pandemic about these geographical relationships within economies.
Luke, you're muted.
Yeah, no, I think this is what for me is fascinating, is that the pandemic itself is characteristic in terms of a very strong super spreaders in very specific local communities. And certainly in the first wave, this was really pretty dramatic. And in this first wave, you could see how Germany responded relatively quickly and easily by having this lander approach to the health sector, by of course having much larger intensive care facilities than most other European countries. So that's of course a very important given factor, which is different. But nevertheless, the organizational setup of the health system in Germany through the lander is pretty unique for most other European countries. And you could see how, when there were various outbreaks, whether it was in meat factories or whether it was in other places because of carnival or other things in this first wave, the response was much more rapid. You see in the second wave that there is more problematic for sure, because then you now see the contradiction between the national policy and the lander policies, etc. But nevertheless, I still would argue that the local response, the local policymakers, the local health authorities are much better informed about where are the super spreaders, how can you introduce quicker a tracing system. And this is very similar to climate crisis. Again, if you look at climate crisis, it's very different from place to place. So this is where, to come back to your point, local authorities, cities in particular, with respect to sustainable, whatever circular economy features, are much more in a much better position to respond quickly to some of those crisis aspects.
So having just talked about the local, I want to go, and we're near the end, back to Jyoti, who raised issues of the international, the global, and what we might think of as re-regionalization or shifting structures in the global economy and how they affect this. She may want to restate her point. I'm interested, she stated as a question, I'm interested in what she actually would add to the discussion, which has been mostly a discussion of, as it were, domestic economies, national economies as conventionally thought. How do you see the international and the global changes as crucial in this moment? You're muted, Jyoti.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting and difficult question. But I think, in a way, I would go with what Sam said earlier on. You can't do this without curbing the power of, in a way, global capital. And so sometimes it's expressed as between countries, whereas actually it is really the power of corporate lobbies in particular countries vis-a-vis everyone else. But at the moment, those powers are still so strong that many of the kinds of things that are being imagined in Wendy and Sam's arguments are not really feasible in developing countries. That, you know, neither civil society nor the state has power over the resources available to do the kinds of things that are required. And a lot of that comes not just from domestic capital, but from global capital. So I would say that right now, unfortunately, and global control over knowledge and global control over all of those other things that we all know. So yeah, I would say the problem of power internationally is absolutely massive, and without curbing the power of not just large corporations, but yes, very rich people, and their ability to lobby advanced governments to do particular strategies. Without curbing that, we really can't talk about these alternatives in a very feasible way in much of the developing world.
And this becomes especially crucial as we think about the situation introduced by COVID, the globalization of finance, the climate change crisis, and so forth, because there are not national self-contained solutions to any of these problems. We've run over time. Let me ask Sam and Wendy if either of them wants to make a very quick closing comment before we wrap the seminar up.
Wendy. Okay, I have two things then. Am I muted?
You're okay.
Okay. There are two things I would say. Both are somewhat cautionary. The first is we've been talking about the power, and the last thing Jayati said about essentially there's going to be conflicts in which the very wealthy will stand to lose, and that's a political battle. We have to think about what coalitions are there that'll come together around what kind of issues, what kind of vernacular, what kind of slogans that will unify people around that axis that has to be one. And I ask this in part because, you know, there was, if you think about the Marxian paradigm, the idea was that the working class people who were unified by having a relationship with an employer would have the conditions for being unified, which would essentially succeed against the employers. Well, as a political proposition, that didn't work out quite as optimistically as Marx thought, at least not in Europe. In some other places it did a bit better. But I'd like us to think the way Marx thought about that. That is, who's going to make this change? What do we have in common? Why will we be willing to fight for each other's interests? And what's the language which will bring us together? That's the first caution. The second caution is this. The century conditions that brought us what so-called Western liberal philosophy, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, and so on, was basically a disastrous century of religious warfare and intolerance. There were more deaths per capita in the 17th century than there were in the 20th century in Europe. And out of that came this idea that, oh, we can harness self-interest. It long predates Smith. It's very articulate in Hume. We're going to harness self-interest, and markets and the liberal state with limited government and so on found a way to do that remarkably well. Actually, it's a kind of a very surprising idea. Now, so we know how it works to have a society in which the key idea is to harness self-interest. We don't know how to organize a society which is liberal and tolerant, which is based on harnessing people's social values, because those social values include tribalism. And we just haven't done that. We haven't done it articulately. I think, obviously, political leaders think about it all the time, the language they use and so on. But I think as thinkers, interested in philosophy, the rules of the game, social science, and so on, we have to think about how do you create a society based on social values that is not also then victim to tribalism?
Well, perhaps that's the note on which we will end. It's a great challenge for us. It's not a simple optimistic promise that things will get better. It's marching orders for continued work, intellectually and practically. Let me again thank Wendy Carlin and Sam Bowles, thank Luc Souete, Jyoti Ghosh, and Danielle Allen, and above all, thank the ISC for creating this opportunity. It's been a pleasure to be with you all. Thanks.